Welcome everyone to Philip Merrill College of Journalism. We're here tonight for a very special program at the Floyd Abrams Center for Constitutional Law at Yale Law School and the First Amendment Salon. It's wonderful to see so many elected and former PhD students and university administrators. Welcome to Night Hall. I'd like to introduce Constitutional Law Professor Ron Collins, who will get us started tonight.
Thank you, Douglas. What a delight it is to be here at the University of Maryland and to be speaking not to law students and people with background in law necessarily, but to journalists and those who are engaged in protecting and advancing those freedoms guaranteed under the press clause and other provisions of the First Amendment. So it's a real delight, and thank you for making this possible today. I'm Ron Collins, and together with my colleague Lee Levine and David Scover, professor at Seattle University, who couldn't be here with us today, we serve as co-chairs of the First Amendment Salon. The Salon began in 2014, so today is our 5th anniversary, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to be here. It's our 21st Salon. The Salons are non-partisan programs that venture to emulate the spirit of Madisonian free speech, namely uninhibited, robust, wide open, and civil. In that regard, we are well suited to be able to host this event today with our distinguished panelists. The salons typically take place in New York or Washington, D.C., at the Ballard Spahr law firm. And by the way, a shout out to that firm, Ballard Spahr, for making the salons possible and for their support and their continued support to the salons. In 2014, the salons began an affiliation with the Floyd Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression at Yale Law School, and we're delighted to continue that, and we hope that will continue for a long time. And so thank you to Floyd and his colleagues at the Floyd Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression at Yale Law School. And a few years back, we decided to take the salons on the road. So we've been to Chicago, Los Angeles, and now here at the university, so we're delighted to have that opportunity. Today's salon will begin with an introduction by my friend and colleague, Floyd Abrams, who is the senior counsel at Cahill, Gordon, and Rendell's litigation practice group. If you don't know who Floyd Abrams is, you probably shouldn't be in this room. But that said, he is considered the preeminent First Amendment lawyer in his field. Among Floyd's many accomplishments, he has authored 3 books, and for a practitioner, that's quite something. And in addition to that, he's argued landmark cases in the United States Supreme Court and elsewhere defending the First Amendment, including freedom of the press. Following Floyd's remarks, I will introduce our 2 panelists for today's program, and then we'll proceed with that. So before that, let me let Floyd kick things off with the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Floyd Abrams.
It's really good to be here, and I appreciate the attendance of all of you. I'm really here to celebrate David McCraw's book titled Truth in Our Times. And I thought I would just give a personalized sort of introduction to the book to you. It's about journalism, because David works at the New York Times, passing on the many multifaceted, sometimes terribly complex decision-making about what sort of material that's in the Times can give rise to litigation, and what sort of litigation is worth fighting, even if it is litigation. It's a book about law, because David's a lawyer, and what he does is to make legal decisions for an entity, the Times, which has its own view, about what is fit to print and whatnot. And it's really about our world. He has a great job. And the book reflects that. Just to give 2 or 3 examples by way of introduction. I think David probably became most famous, or depending on your view of the world, notorious during the political campaign in October 2016, when lawyers for Donald Trump threatened to bring a libel suit against the Times for an article entitled, "Two Women Say Trump Touched Them Inappropriately." And it fell to David and his colleagues to decide how to respond in the midst, this was October, less than a month before the election, how to respond to a legal threat of that sort, because it is, in truth, not just a legal threat, it is a political threat. It is a threat about the bona fides of the New York Times itself. If this sort of story on page 1 had not been true, had not been defensible, had not been, within the appropriate realm for journalism in America, it obviously would have had great impact on the reputation of the Times, and who knows, on the political campaign as it occurred. And David wrote a letter, which is on the back of his book, responding to the letter from then candidate Trump's side, which wound up saying this: "We did what the law allows. We published newsworthy information about a subject of deep public concern. If Mr. Trump disagrees, if he believes that American citizens had no right to hear what these women had to say, and that the law of this country forces us and those who would criticize him to stand silent or not to be published, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight." There was no libel suit. President Trump was not the only individual who was threatened libel suits that were not thereafter brought, although he is certainly one of the more frequent threateners. So if you sort of start with that, that's one of the things David does, which is described in the book. But I think what I found, if I had to say, most interesting and least predictable to me, is him sitting with his colleagues and reading the communications of readers of the Times who are unhappy with it, sometimes threatening litigation, sometimes just screaming, verbally, screaming. And 2 of the ones that interested me most had the same tone to them. One was liberal readers of the Times protesting what they thought and what they would characterize as the normalization of Trump. That many people were upset at the tone, what they perceived to be the tone of the Times coverage, not the objection Trump has made that it's biased or fake news. Far from that. But writing about Trump in the same tone one might use about other political candidates running for office, and in particular running for president, without avoiding whatever the topic was. The one that interested me more, because I had the same reaction as protesting readers, was a magazine article about a sort of nice guy, pleasant fellow, who happened to be an American Nazi. And the New York Times had a magazine article about the Nazi next door, who helped out with chores, who got along with his neighbors, who didn't go around screaming at people, but was a genuine, off-the-wall believer. And the Times was, and my reaction when I read it, like so many readers, is, why are you making a hero out of this guy? I mean, yeah, he's a nice guy, so some Nazi's a nice guy. Why is that a news story? Why is that a magazine story? And it's still, fair game to argue about that. But I was sort of struck in reading David's book that, again, the word, or a word, that some of the critics used was the normalization. You're doing a profile on someone with evil views, with views that, if enacted into law, would bring back memories and worse of the worst of Nazi Germany. And I thought of the editors at the Times, and of David, and of the cadre of people there, sort of thinking seriously, hard, about offering that story, defending that story, or not, or apologizing for that story, or at least what might be a reaction someone might have on it. The book is filled with interesting problems, issues. They're not all legal, as the one I just mentioned is not, but they're all really interesting. And I really recommend it to you. And I lift my, what's the word? It used to be invisible. Virtual. I'm dating myself. My virtual glass to tribute to David. And I thank all of you for coming.
Thank you, Floyd. As I like to tell my students, the First Amendment is what we, the people, make it. And by that measure, we are very privileged to have two distinguished people who dedicated their careers to making that First Amendment real and vibrant. You know Lucy Douglas. She's the dean of your school here. You probably know that she served as the executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, where years ago I got to work with her. Some of you know that she was a practicing media lawyer, and others may know that she was a reporter for a newspaper. If merit is the measure, this is the woman when it comes to First Amendment. And so we're delighted to have her engage in a dialogue today. So thank you, Lucy. And as for David McCraw, well, you heard about him. He's the author. May I have that book again? What? I just, oh, excuse me. Sorry. Thank you. As an author, I can just tell you that you always want people to plug your book. He hasn't asked me, he's too polite to do so. But here's the book, Truth in Our Times, and it's going to be available, right?
Be available out in the hallway.
All right, and so you can purchase it, and he'll sign it at no extra charge. So that book. And we're so delighted to have him here. As you, some of you may know, he has spent the last 16 years with the New York Times serving as their newsroom lawyer. And he is the author of this important and new timely book. I think yesterday the president must have been mindful of this event because not one time but 50 plus times he tweeted about the press, including the New York Times. So our topic couldn't be more timely. So in that regard, we're so delighted to have David here with us. And with that, I'm going to allow them, or invite them, I should say, to engage in conversation and dialogue. After that, we will take questions from the audience, and thereafter we'll have books available for you to purchase and for you to sign. And with that, let me turn it over to Lucy and David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome again to everyone. As Ron said, we're going to talk for a while, and then we'll open the program to you so that you can ask questions. And to just echo what Floyd said, David, you just have the greatest job in the world. I mean, I read this. This thing is dog-eared, it's underlined, it's flagged. It's like, oh my God, I remember that story. It's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you. I hope the green doesn't mean stuff you disagree with.
No, they're all quoted.
Okay. All right.
Pink has to do with the quote from the letter, the
All right.
piece of ass
All right.
letter,
Thank you.
which I really commend you. Read the back of the cover. Everything else. It's wonderful. You know, you have an incredible temperament that shows in the book. You're completely unflappable. And I've known you long enough to know that it's not an act. You truly are unflappable. We have some things in common. You grew up in Illinois. I grew up in North Dakota. We both worked for small and medium-sized newsrooms. The Quad City Times in Davenport, the Grand Forks Herald for me. We majored in journalism at state universities in the Midwest. We both went to law school in our mid-30s and got the media law bug. And today we're in the same room, breathing the same air, and sitting here as media law experts in front of the great Floyd Abrams. Are we lucky or what?
How about that? Yeah. Somebody made a mistake.
It's pretty amazing. You know, the book, you started out right after in 9/11, you were working for the New York Daily
That's correct,
News.
yeah.
And then in about 2002 or 3, you moved over to be the newsroom lawyer for the New York Times. So you were covering the aftermath of 9/11 during the George W. Bush administration and all the issues that were raised then. You cover everything from anonymous sources to negotiating the release of reporters who are held hostage working for the New York Times overseas, which probably is not something you ever expected.
Never. I'm a person who got a passport at age 39. I don't know. The world was not my oyster as a young person. Yeah.
So, and I really enjoyed the part of the book. I didn't enjoy it, it was horrific, but part of the book where you were dealing with, the FBI apparently handles all kidnapping cases,
Right.
even in places where they have no FBI agents.
Had no clue, yeah.
And they have no clue what's going on. And there's a part of the book where you talk to someone and he says, yeah, let us know how your operation is going.
Yes, yeah. What had happened, David Rhodes had been kidnapped in 2008, in October of 2008. He'd gone out to interview a Taliban commander. It was set up, he and two of his Afghan colleagues were taken. And 3 years earlier, I had written a crisis management plan. That's what lawyers do. They sit around and write plans. And I'd written it, and as far as I know, it was put away, and nobody ever thought about it again. And then David was kidnapped, and I get a call from the newsroom, sort of one of those, you were the guy who wrote the crisis management plan, why don't you come down here and manage this crisis sort of conversation, which seemed a little unfortunate for me. And as I tell David, you know, that however scared he was the Taliban had him, he would have been more scared to know I was the person who was scared. So for the next 7 months, I worked with his family and our outside consultants day after day on this to try to figure out some way to get David back. And it's very frustrating, and nothing seems to work. We have lots and lots of contacts here, there, and everywhere, but the fact was the Taliban had him, and that just seemed to be unmovable. And then on a June night, I'm in a car, 7 o'clock in the evening in Manhattan. My cell phone rings, and it's David's wife, and she says, David just called my mother, he's escaped and he needs help. And a million things go through my mind, including why would a guy call his mother-in-law right after he's been released from That surely is not the person. Maybe he does something to your mind. It turned out that his mother-in-law just happened to be sitting there and she answered the phone. But as Lucy was saying, I jump in a cab. I'm heading down to the apartment of David's wife because we wanted to be in the same room as we tried to figure out how we could get him out of Pakistan. He had escaped with one of his Afghan colleagues to a garrison, technically held by the Pakistanis, but there was no guarantee they would keep him. There was no guarantee that if the Haqqani family came looking, that they wouldn't turn him back. And as I'm going downtown, I'm talking to this lawyer in Kabul. It's 4 a.m. there at the embassy, at our embassy in Kabul, and I can hear the kind of clipboard thing of, you know, who I am, who David is, who the mother-in-law is, what time the call came, and all this. And then he says, you know, just rest assured, Mr. McCraw, I will do nothing to stand in the way of your operation. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a First Amendment lawyer. I once wrote a crisis management plan. I'm in a taxi cab on the west side of New York. I have no operation. I need you to have an operation.
But you eventually, David made his way back.
He did. It was a really incredible night. I'm very hard on the FBI in the book, except for that night when they were champs. They stayed on the phone throughout the night. David's family, relentless, would not stop, and we were all on the phone. We were all calling our contacts in the government, the United States government, to try to get the government in Pakistan to go in and get him. That's what we wanted. They needed to go up there and get him. And at one point, an aide to General Petraeus calls back and says, please stop calling people. All we are doing is answering phone calls. We cannot do a rescue if all we're doing is answering phone calls. But we felt that we'd gotten through at that point.
Floyd mentioned, and Ron mentioned, the tweets.
Yeah.
Relentless tweeting. But you were familiar with Donald Trump long before he decided to run for president. And I mean, you dealt with him, you dealt with his lawyers, you dealt with reporters who had to deal with him. And in the book you write, I was wrong about Trump for much too long. You said you were dismissive of the damage he could or would inflict on journalism and the First Amendment for too long. So you had dealt with him as a New York businessman. What did you expect and what did we actually get?
Yeah. So a couple things that any of you who haven't read the book, I should tell you, it is an absolute testament to unfounded optimism. I am always hopeful and I'm always wrong. Okay, so I keep saying it's going to be okay. It's not going to be okay. I'm still going to say it's okay. I just can't get over myself here. But so I really felt that the institutions were strong enough that there were guardrails, and the president can veer to the left, the president can veer to the right, but the entrenched civil servants, the political class, Congress, of course the press, would keep it so it was somewhere in what I thought of as the Nixon lane. That it wouldn't be great, but that there would be a respect for American values and American institutions, and I really thought that was going to get there. And in part, I didn't know whether Trump was going to be that energetic as a president. He seemed to love campaigning. I thought perhaps he would coach once he got into the White House. And I talk about being at a forum at NYU just before the election, and Jack Goldsmith, the Harvard professor, is there. I'm there, and we're both essentially saying that point that Jack, who was, of course, in the Bush administration, said, you can't believe how hard it is to change things in government. You can't believe all the obstacles you run into, no matter what it is that you feel is the right thing to do or what you feel is the political thing to do. And that it wasn't going to matter that much. And in fact, whatever led me to that belief was completely wrong. That there was, in fact, a disregard for institutions, a denigration of institutions, a disregard for American values. We see that in the tweet storm. I wish he would tweet about my book. It was really good. I even said nice things about his lawyer in the book.
You did.
Try to prompt. That would have to be fake news, right?
It's just, well, does in your experience in dealing with him and his lawyers and his team, does he really hate the media, or is it a device for him to get what he wants?
It's a really good question. He gave an interview to a group of New York Times reporters a few months ago now, and he made what was a really interesting point. He said, and our publisher was there as well, A.G. Sulzberger. He said, can I get one nice newspaper, or one nice story in my newspaper? And he really thought of it as his hometown newspaper, and a guy from Queens, he felt that way. I think it's very hard to pigeonhole him that way, that he will say awful things about reporters with whom he has wonderful relationships. He talks to, he calls, and so forth. He's accessible in that way. I do think, I guess if I've never met the man, I've dealt with his lawyers more than I care to, I do think that at some level it enrages him that he can't control the media. So he may like individual members of it, but I do think he at some very fundamental level wants to be able to control the message. Twitter came along just in time for it.
Well, A.G. Sulzberger had that sort of famous meeting with him.
Yeah.
At the end of the interview, where he said, "Look, Mr. President, you're putting targets on the back of journalists all over the world." Do you think that resonated at all?
No. I mean, he was immediately back to talking about fake news again. I mean, there are many problems with the whole fake news mantra. The first one, of course, is that it sounds like the pursuit of truth when it's just the opposite. It sounds like something somebody would say when they were interested in truth, and it's just the opposite. It is an invitation to label and disregard rather than to read and discern. Exactly the opposite of what we need. And so that is the domestic problem. The foreign problem is that all across the world, in the worst places, worst governments, they're adopting that. They're passing fake news laws. And they think not only do they get away with it, but it is a way to curry favor in Washington. If they say it in Washington, why wouldn't we say it here? And it puts a target on the back of their local reporters. It makes it incredibly hard for our reporters. Over the weekend, this past weekend, we had done a story about the Egyptian elections, and the ministry, the information ministry, calls in our reporter and questions her for extended period of time about her story and why are you doing this and all that sort of thing. And in the end, nothing really comes of that, but you're put on notice that we're watching and you're here at our pleasure, and if you don't do what we like, you're not going to be here. There was a time when a government like Egypt would never have done that. Because they would have got called from the embassy, they would have realized that they were jeopardizing their relationship with the United States by doing that. None of that fear exists anymore.
Mm. And do your reporters, when you're dealing with them, do they understand that? Are they fearful? Are you taking any special? Do you have an emergency management plan?
We've pulled the plan out of the drawer. It's on my desk now. Yeah, I mean, our people are incredibly resilient, and I don't know how they do it. We obviously take security very seriously now. You remember you used to come to our building, you could walk right in. Now you have barricades out there to stop car bombs. Security, we have a 24/7 security hotline now. And that's just for America. We take very seriously protecting our journalists abroad. And it is an amazing level of resilience, but it shouldn't be necessary. Look, the world is tough, especially being a foreign correspondent has always been tough. And you have to worry about everything from car accidents, because there's nobody coming to get you. If you're hurt in a car accident, there's no emergency services, there's no hospitals nearby. You have to be worried about being shot randomly, covering wars, you got to worry about Ebola, whatever it might be. But the idea that you now have to worry about governments coming after you is now taken to a whole different level.
Other than that, has your day-to-day job changed much since Trump got elected?
Not necessarily because of him. Obviously, some things have changed. One is that I feel, and this is part of the reason behind the book, that those of us who are not in the machinery of reporting need to speak up about the importance of the free press. And that's what our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, has done. I hope I've done some of that in the book. And the second thing is that we certainly hear a lot more when people threaten us with libel about fake news and you're making stuff up and so forth. It's sort of created an environment. Now, we have not seen the great uptick in libel cases that I think people thought would come, but it's clearly that even lawyers I know to be sensible saying good lawyers will slip, I actually had a lawyer from a big firm in New York who writes a letter about fake news, and he calls me and says, "I'm so sorry. I don't know where that came from." I'm going, well, I think I know where it came from. You were typed it, man. But it's just kind of an instinct now. But in security has become a bigger part of it domestically. But in many ways, the reporting has been incredible. I was at the first event I did for the book was at the Tucson Festival of Books, and I found myself on a panel, and the person on the right said, "It's a golden age for journalism," and goes off on that. Then the person on my left says it's an ice age for journalism, that it's never been worse, and in terms of local journalism and the destruction of local journalism. And I'm left to break the tie, being the moderate that I portray myself to be in the book. And they're both right? that in terms of Washington reporting, in terms of data-driven reporting, it is incredible. It's incredible what journalists are doing. In terms of what's going on in news deserts, towns, cities that don't have any journalism anymore, it is devastation.
Well, let's switch up from Washington politics for a minute and talk about an episode that's actually been suddenly in the news again in the past few weeks, and we certainly talk about it here at Merrill College. In June of 2010, during the administration of another president, you got a phone call while you were at the dentist from editor Bill Keller's office. And they said, "Get down here immediately." And you walk into a meeting, and they're talking about hundreds of thousands of documents. There's a room full of reporters. They're talking about deals with Der Spiegel and The Guardian. And they tell you they've got the largest trove of leaked classified documents in history dropped on them by the founder of WikiLeaks, a guy by the name of Julian Assange. So at one point, the Times reporters, you're sitting there listening to all this, and at one point they turned to you and asked, "Can we do it?" Meaning, can we publish this stuff? And you said, "I think so." What does it mean when a newsroom lawyer says, "I think so"?
I'll get back. Yeah, it was the first time in my personal history, I don't know if other people have had this feeling, that I actually want to go back to the dentist and have a it didn't seem like really the greatest time. In many ways, because of the great work that Floyd Abrams and others have done, the template had been set, right? That the right to publish information that was true in the public interest, that we had not done anything illegal to obtain, was firmly established. And so my world, my life, my decision-making, much easier because of what Floyd had done and others in the preceding 30 years. On the other hand, this seemed so different from the leaks that I had been dealing with and people have been dealing with, that where you have I'll use Daniel Ellsberg as sort of the model here, someone who's motivated has come forward and said, people need to know this. It's in the public interest, and I'm not supposed to give it to you, but I'm going to give it to you. You need to get this out. Here you had sort of a profligate frothing of information. And I wondered at the time, is this going to be the one? Is this the one where a president decides?
You weren't the only one.
Right. Is this the one where someone's going to say, the world has changed, the media has changed, the nature of leaks has changed, and we need to draw the line? Okay, so it was a concern. The other thing I point out in the book is that, which had not occurred to me, I think, as clearly until that leak, was all these sort of secondary or tertiary legal questions you have. Do you have to let your board know? I mean, we're a public company, right? We're about to do something that somebody may call a crime, and ultimately, people like Joe Lieberman did call a crime. Do you have to put it on notice? Do you have to worry about your non-American employees who are working there? Will this affect their immigration status if they find out, somebody finds out they're working on it? You worry about things about, what if we get hacked? Here's this information that we now have. We're going to publish a very small part of it. We're going to be scrupulous about figuring out what we can and should publish. But the rest of it's sitting there. If we get hacked, haven't we just done the bidding of the Chinese, the Russians, whomever it might be? And as I point out in the book, the solution was they kept changing the password, so I could never get to the damn stuff when I needed it. Because I had to call somebody and figure out what the new password was.
Did you know at the time who it came from?
Yeah. And that was the one easy thing. In most of these cases, right, as you know, Lucy, the really hard part for most journalism, for most journalists, for most news organizations, is protecting a confidential source.
Right.
And in this case, Assange was out front that it was coming from him, and by the time we got them, Private Manning had been arrested. Mm-hmm. So the confidential source problem, which is enormous and troubling and probably the greatest weakness in press law in the United States, mm-hmm. was not going to be the issue. It was really going to be about whether the government was going to push back and either try to stop us from publishing, which seemed unlikely, or decide that reporters and journalists and editors could be charged under the Espionage Act.
Well, let me take a little slightly different twist, and our students who've taken media law and our media law teachers here. You had some international partners, and I think if I remember right, they actually were involved first. They were The Guardian in the UK and Der Spiegel. And why did they want an American partner? It's very cloak and dagger.
Right.
Right,
and this comes up with the Snowden leaks as well. They thought that working through an American publisher, working with an American publisher, the First Amendment would protect. And certainly when we talked to The Guardian, we didn't have quite as much interaction with Der Spiegel, but certainly The Guardian was concerned about having an injunction.
Right.
And being stopped from publishing
under the Official Secrets
Act. Under the Official Secrets Act, and under English law, that seemed like it was possible. And we split ways because our normal procedure in these things is before we publish, we go to the government. Right. It's not a veto. In fact, it's more frustration for the government, where the government says, here it is, our concerns about this, and we hear them out, our editors hear them out. And they make a decision. Usually it's a decision to publish, but sometimes they'll hear something, they'll say, well, that could endanger lives, I'm not going to do that. The Guardian did not want any part of that. They did not want the American government to know that they had the documents because they were concerned that there would be a call to Britain and they would face an injunction.
And in fact, once things were published, the intelligence officials in the UK went after the Guardian.
Yes, on the
with the hard drive. Right?
Yeah, not on WikiLeaks, but on the Snowden one.
Yeah. Snowden.
Yeah. We just don't. It's baked in now, thanks to Floyd's good work. But it's baked in that the Pentagon Papers may not have said a whole lot really legally, but it has come to stand for the proposition that injunctions in these kind of cases are not going to be had. People know that from watching a movie called The Host. Someday there will be a story about the Washington Post published the Snowden documents, and it will be called The Times.
The
Times.
A little bit of an edge there.
Yeah.
Well, today, now that he's no longer in Ecuador, and everything, how's the New York Times' relationship with Mr. Assange?
We don't have much of a relationship with Julian Assange. I mean, Julian Assange became very unhappy with us during the actual publication, and there were several reasons for that. One is we would not link to his site because we felt that his site was not taking enough care with what got published and what didn't. And we weren't alone in that. Human rights organizations criticized WikiLeaks because some of the materials that ended up being posted on WikiLeaks actually identified average on-the-street Afghans who were helping the U.S. and endangered their lives. And human rights groups protested that when it happened, and so we wouldn't link. They were unhappy with our portrayal of him, with Julian. They were unhappy of our portrayal of Manning. And by the end, it was a very fraught relationship. I can say this in a journalism school. So Bill Keller, our editor, and I and others were out doing a panel at the journalism school at Berkeley, and they brought in Julian by Skype.
I was there.
Right.
Yeah.
So Julian is way up. There's like something out of it. It's like something out of 1984. Julian's way up there, and he's denouncing Bill and me. And if you know Julian, when he gets going, he doesn't stop. So he's denouncing and denouncing. He's unaware that lunch has been declared. And if you declare lunch at a journalism school, the audience will leave. Okay? Free food, we're gone. Okay? So the denouncing continued.
Well, we'll switch topics again for a minute. All of our students here at Merrill College at some point, they are going to be experienced in filing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act, or the comparable state transparency laws. So on behalf of your client, I'll bet you have filed and litigated more FOIA requests than any lawyer in America.
Well, I think there are a few around at the ACLU like groups you probably have, but certainly in mainstream media, I have engaged in a higher level of frustration more often than anybody, and have continued to pound my head against the proverbial wall, filing FOIA suits. And we have continued. We filed, I think, 35 during the Obama administration, and the number 2 was Fox with 5. They haven't filed any recently. Funny on that one. We, on the other hand, had 17 in the first 17 months of the Trump administration. So we continue to push it. I have my reasons, and they're not all delusional.
Well, so you sued the Obama administration more than 30 times, but when it comes to transparency, were they that much better?
People ask that question all the time, and they were not. I think governments, because they're governments, tend to believe in their own righteous judgments, that we know what should be secret, you don't, and we know what should be public, and you don't, and we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. In some ways, there was more hypocrisy under Obama than there was under Bush or Trump. Bush and Trump, the administrations knew that they were really like, we're not going to give it to you because we don't want you to have it. Where the Obamas would say, well, why are you asking this? We're all in this together. If we could give it to you, we would, but we can't. And so it was always a little frustrating. But FOIA is hardwired for frustration these days. And I wrote on the 50th anniversary of FOIA about an article that Ralph Nader had written right after FOIA was passed. And it was called the Freedom from Information Act because the thing was already running off track by passed in '66.
One of the things I really love too, I love the examples you had of some of the catch-22 crazy responses, and particularly from the intelligence agencies. Can you explain to our audience what a GLOMAR response is?
I can. And so we're going to talk about this, and it's going to be a little bit legalistic. I do want to put in this that the book was really not meant for lawyers. I want to write a popular book that for readers who really kind of captured the good and the bad of journalism, and how the law made so much journalism possible, and how it worked, and a lot of goofy things happened at the New York Times. I want to capture some of that too. So, but I'm happy to talk about the legal thing. A GLOMAR response is when the government says that it cannot tell you whether or not it has documents. that the fact that it either does or does not have documents is itself a secret. And so you end up in this very Alice in Wonderland-like conversation with the government about it, because in one case that we litigated in front of Judge Rakoff in the Southern District of New York, we requested documents. They came back with a Glomar, which was a little awkward because we actually listed the titles and dates, the documents, because our reporters had seen them. And the example I use is the one from a case called Taylor versus NSA. Mike Taylor was a pro se litigant who sued the NSA under the Freedom of Information Act to find out what information they had about the electrodes that the NSA had planted in his brain. Okay, that was his issue. Was, I know I have electrodes in my brain. I know you're watching my thoughts. What documents do you have? And they came back with a Glomar response that they couldn't tell me what they had. It's really kind of cruel.
Classic Glomar response.
Yeah. I mean, the strangest, the FOIA things, though, of course, is the night that they sent me a classified document by mistake, right? So the way this works is a lot of the suits we bring are designed for a single purpose, and that's just to get a response. We haven't got a response, so we sue the government. Now it's a lawyer's problem. It's no longer a FOIA officer's problem. So now a lawyer has to go to the agency and say, look, I'm going to have a judge breathing down my neck. Can't we start producing documents? They start producing documents, and the case never actually gets to any sort of litigation. It's just a way to force the government to actually do what they were supposed to in the first place, which is turn over documents. So we're having this huge production of documents about surveillance, about the government surveillance, the collection of telephone data in particular. And so what would happen is on Friday afternoon, about every 3 months, the government would send me this big trove of documents, many of them redacted, most of them redacted. It would just go on. And it comes in, and on a Friday night, or excuse me, on a Thursday night in this one case, and I send it on to the reporter, and the reporter calls me and says, did you see there's a classified document in there? And I said, I didn't see that, nor do I want to know about that. I mean, that's the last thing we want to know. Because one of the things we do is because we don't know who else has asked for that same stuff, we don't want to get scooped on it. And so the next day, the Times started reporting out about that document, which actually had some interesting information, and it identified one particular phone company that had been involved in the mass collection of information, of the telephone data. And, the lawyers call me, and they, from the government, say, you got to give it back. You got to give it back. And I said, I'll give it back when a federal judge tells me to give it back. And this call the judge now, and they said, well, we're not authorized yet. So they call back later. And they finally say to me, early in the afternoon, that, and this seemed really low to me, they said, when this happened to the ACLU gave it back. And I knew what they were thinking, like patriotism, ISIS, ACLU, New York Times. Like, are you really? So I called up the ACLU and asked them, and they, said, well, it had happened, and it wasn't much of a document. They didn't want to get. They had their own litigation strategic reasons for it. And ultimately, we published it. We still have the document. And the government, because this document comes up in other litigation, the document inevitably puts in a declaration that says we have no idea where the New York Times got that thing. And I put in a declaration that says, I'll tell you where we got it.
Well, before we open to questions from the audience, let's move on from stories involving politics and the government and the president. Let's talk about the New York Times' Pulitzer Prize winning investigation into the activities of Harvey Weinstein that led to the tea movement, which obviously has had international impact. So you're getting ready to leave town. I think you said you were going to Paris. And reporter Jody Cantor calls you, looking for you, and she says, there's an explosive story we're working on. Now, tell us how explosive stories usually go and how this one was different.
Yeah, I want to correct one thing in your question, because this just shows you what Jody and Megan are like. In my book, in the original draft, it said that their stories led to the Me Too movement, and they said that's not true.
Okay.
They said that we moved it along, but we were standing in, on the work of a lot of people who had done stuff before us, and so I hate when they have that much integrity.
I will never say that again.
But no, but it was, I was really touched by the fact that, I was giving them a herogram, and they were saying, no, look, this to be realistic. What we did was important, but it wasn't the first. Anyway, so, this struck me as kind of the classic, we were going to have a he said, she said, and it was never going to be resolved. It was never going to be resolved. He and his lawyers were going to deny it. They would put pressure on us. They were advertisers, and that they would probably pull their advertising for some period of time. We were okay with that. They would come back at some period of time, and that not much would change. And I was so wrong about that. And part of that just has to do with the quality of the reporting that was done, because we really wanted to try to move it beyond the he said, she said. And I thought all the people who worked on the stories at Times did an incredible job of trying to find a way to take it out of a room in which there are two people, and only those two people really know what happened. And so it was getting people to walk away from NDAs. It was finding settlements.
Non-disclosure agreements.
Non-disclosure agreements, thanks. It was going to people and saying, did that person talk to you about it at the time? It doesn't prove it happened, but it's really powerful as this is, even though it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whenever it was, that this was a real thing. And I think our ability to do that was so important, and also encouraged so many other people to come forward. And as I talk about in the book, lawyers were raining from the sky. It was unbelievable. The different lawyers that Harvey was bringing into the mix.
And they'd be in and they'd be out.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, you're right. They didn't seem to like each other much, did they? And I didn't like them much either. So I guess we all had that in common. And so I was working really hard on trying to make sure our story was going to stand up, that we weren't going to make an inadvertent error, that there wasn't going to be any implications that we couldn't live with. And I sent the story back to the newsroom, and then I believe it was Megan called and said, don't worry about it, Ashley Judd is going to go on the record. And that was such an important moment, and they really got it, that if Ashley Judd was going to put her name on the story, that was going to be the beginning of the disclosure. This brings us up in the book, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that just before the story about Harvey Weinstein and sexual misconduct, we did a very, very legalistic story about Harvey Weinstein's dubious behavior as a member of a board of a charity.
Right.
That he was on one charity, and he was getting people to donate things to it, but then the money was going to go from that charity, which was an AIDS charity, to a theater nonprofit, which, by the way, was producing a Harvey Weinstein play, and he was going to get his money back as a result of the money flowing there. And it was a deep dive into New York nonprofit law and all that kind of stuff. And when I was asked about it, I couldn't quite make heads or tails out of whether it's an important story or whether it was it. But the important thing was, Jody and Megan came to believe, it was the story that showed people we weren't scared of him. And that if we weren't scared of him and his money and his influence and his lawyers and his friendship with important people, that we were going to go ahead with the story that we were really about to do.
Well, let's open the session to questions from the audience. Anybody? Deb?
Anonymous sources.
This is, and let's introduce ourselves, okay?
Associate professor here. I teach one of the media law classes and investigative reporting as well. So anonymous sources do the British privilege. Residents are not terribly favorable, right? So do you get involved, or is your advice sought by reporters on how and when to grant anonymity?
Yeah, it's
What do you say? What do you tell?
right.
Which one do you
I'm
tell
just
our
supposed to reveal
students?
legal secrets here, okay? Yeah. So no, I'm happy to talk about this. Generally, not in any particular story, but in the overarching, we spent a lot of time talking about it. And at one point, we did something which I thought was really helpful. Is I was paired up with a really top-notch investigative reporter, and we went from desk to desk holding seminars about how to get people on the record, the legal aspects if we had an anonymous source. We all want it on the source. We all want it on the record. We want all the sources on the record we can. The fact is that there are certain stories that need to be told with anonymous sources. So my main concern, my main issue when I'm giving seminars on this is that people be really clear about what they mean about off the record. What is the commitment you're making, and are you? And that should be the last thing that you offer, not the first thing. That let's start with trying to get people on the record. Let's see how much we can get on the record first, because we should be as transparent as possible. The public expects that. The public needs that. But inevitably, we're going to use anonymous sources. The interesting thing is it doesn't, and you may just have been lucky, but in the 16 years I've been there, it hasn't come up that often as an issue where we were really in a legal knockdown, drag-out fight. We know the big ones, Judy Miller, Tim Risen, but it wasn't like there was a whole bunch of small ones happening off camera. That for the most part, that's what we went forward with. And in many ways, our subpoena issue, just to go beyond the question a little bit, in many ways tends to be much more of a state issue where people just want our reporters to be witnesses because they make good reports.
One thing that when I was in my days at the Reporters Committee that I could always count on was if there were blanket subpoenas sent out to USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, the Post, the Times, I could kind of predict what the response was going to be. The New York Times was going to fight it and be relatively transparent about it. And another publication that I won't mention was going to try to obfuscate it and cut a deal. And everybody else was kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
Is it kind of Times philosophy to fight it?
Well, I think so, and I think that helps in the long run. It's a little bit like our philosophy about libel, that we're not going to pay defendants to go away. If they sue us, they better be in for the long run. We're not going to settle for money in the United States with them. And I think, while it's short term, has been an expensive proposition. There are cases we could have settled. There was one I remember we could have settled for $18,000. We ended up spending $700,000 to win it. If you're an accountant, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That makes a whole lot of sense. And I think it's the same way that if we dig in and they know that there's going to be a public battle and so forth. It's, and you know this from your own work, the government can make their case without us more often than not now.
Which we learned particularly in the Jim Risen case.
Right. So I now have talked to AUSAs who call and say, would your reporters help? And I said, no, they wouldn't. And I have actually had one recently say, well, you'll never hear from me again. They don't even threaten anymore. Like, oh, well, there's going to be a problem.
Over here, Ralph.
Hi, David. My name's Ralph Crosby. I'm a member of the college's Board of Governors, a former reporter and White House correspondent. And my question deals with White House correspondence. So your report made it very clear that Sarah Huckabee Sanders lied, and she admitted it. So now, in the future, when reporters talk to her, how do they handle what she says?
I'm thankful as a lawyer I will never have to actually answer that question except here tonight. I think that it becomes part of the context. In some ways, Mueller told them something they already knew, right? And I think I can say this, that the people who covered Michael Cohen often had this feeling that 50% of it was just untrue, 50% of it had some basis for looking into. I think that they have to approach it that way. I heard somebody on the radio when the White House correspondents, not for the Times, say that she thought this was the first administration that ever lied to her face, as opposed to just sort of half truths and this sort of thing, but it actually flat out lied. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's the reality that some skepticism is more than usual is now required.
So, Marty.
Marty Kaiser, I'm faculty here at Merrill. You mentioned in your book briefly getting caught between editors and reporters, each trying to pull you in on one side. And as someone who spent many years as an editor, actually hired Megan Twohey for her first job, very proud of that, and worked with Rebecca Corbett. Talk a little bit about how you deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that always makes me a little bit uncomfortable is that when I'm asked to try to resolve journalism questions, what makes it uncomfortable for me is I'd really like to do it because I really love journalism and I think I'm good at it. I really like to make the decision, but I don't get paid to do that. But what makes it really uncomfortable is when I'm giving legal advice, I want people to pay attention to me. And if I'm just giving journalism advice, they should not pay attention to me unless they want to. And it creates, I think, a certain amount of dissonance where, was that a legal opinion or is that a journalism opinion? So I try to be very clear about when I'm talking about, as a reader, I had this feeling about it. Or when you told me that, here's what I think as a reader about that story, and what I would really like, what I wouldn't. And I try to keep that line clear. It's not always easy to do, and as you know, Lucy, that the law isn't about fairness, and we're not the fairness police. If you get sued, all the unfair parts will be talked about over and over again in court as if that's you used that word and you knew it was inflammatory or whatever it might be. So I'm fortunate that I have a great working relationship with the journalist, but I try not to get caught in that. And in fact, you identified Rebecca and Megan were precisely the two people that I got caught between on one of the Weinstein stories, on their charity story. And if you talk to them, and when they talk about the book, I revealed to them that when I was talking to Rebecca by herself, I said, "No, this isn't much of a story. I don't think I'd run it." And when I said, "Megan, you got it. That didn't make their lives all that easy.
Did they ask you when you're saying? I mean, what I always found helpful is saying, "This is my legal view." Journalistically, as a reader, I might like this. Did they listen to you on that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, people tend to have a respect for my opinions about journalism, and so yeah, I think I have a good relationship with them. There's a lot of sensitivity around the book because I guess I can say this. I took 12 weeks off and wrote the book, and most people said, "You can't write. Real writers can't write a book in 12 weeks." And so, like, are you serious? And I point out that, but people who aren't real writers don't know any better. So the difference between good writers and bad writers is, between lawyer writers is real writers look and go, "That's not very good," and lawyer writers go, "That's kind of great. I'm going to go."
Connie?
Yes, Sullivan versus New York Times. I think I've read recently that there's some people who believe the Supreme Court might be open to rethinking it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, Clarence Thomas has written that he thinks Times versus Sullivan was wrongfully decided, and that it should be revisited and so forth. I think Lee and Ron have actually addressed that very compellingly from a legal standpoint about why that's not so. But I look at it at a higher level. I'm not going to get into the constitutional doctrine, not one of my strengths. I don't know any serious person in America who's sitting around going, I've been looking around about the country, and the one problem we have is rich guys can't sue easily enough. That's just not one of the pressing parts of the American agenda today. And the other thing, though, is that it worked. What Justice Brennan wanted to do, and what the other 8 justices on the Supreme Court wanted to do, was to stop powerful people from using libel suits to silence the press. And they came up with a rule that worked, okay? And you can be sure that if it weren't for Times versus Sullivan, that I would not be essentially a one-man band at the New York Times. I would have 17 colleagues, all lawyers, trying to keep from getting sued and dealing with the fallout from lawsuits we were losing. The idea of changing that I find particularly unsettling, because it has done what America needed to do in 1964, and that was stop powerful Southern politicians and Southern power brokers from using libel laws to stop the Northern press from telling the truth about civil rights. Like most libel suits, those libel suits were not about the protection of reputation, they were about the suppression of speech, and that's why it was so important to change the law. The one mystery to me about the whole thing is that 4 weeks ago now, the president lost a libel suit, okay? He was the defendant. He lost on appeal, and one of the contestants in The Apprentice sued him for libel, went to the appellate division in New York, and the appellate division said this case should go to trial, and that she should get to prove that Donald Trump defamed her. Trump should be lining up on our side of the ball. All of the preposterous arguments I make as a defense, all the things that I say, all those great defenses I use, he's going to need. He is a libel defendant more often than he is a plaintiff. Why wouldn't we say, Times versus Sullivan, that's a great deal.
Well, I'd like to point out that 2 authoritative experts on New York Times versus Sullivan, Steve Ramil and Lee Levine, are here in the audience tonight. They've written an incredible book about the case, and I will loan it to anybody. And they would sell it to you, too.
We have it in the trunk.
If you'd like to talk about it more, I'm sure they will be at the cocktail hour. Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Potterell. I'm the general counsel here at the university. And again, I'm really delighted that you're here.
Thank you.
I'm also an old Detroit Free Press carrier. Love newspapers, and have really got much chagrin and regret about how we've seen this disinvestment nationally in newsrooms and things like that. And I'm just sort of wondering, and I hear about all these scenarios and anecdotes. The Times seems to, in my view, kind of stand alone or stand atop right now in terms of having resources that continue to get investigated in top flight investigative journalism. And I wonder, as you work through these different scenarios, does it impact those conversations and decisions to think about the fact that if the New York Times doesn't do this, no one else can or will?
Yeah, I think that's right. We feel it, and there's been great work done at the Washington Post. There's great work being done at a lot of places, Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. And I think that in part that's driven by this understanding that we are now a much smaller tribe than we once used to be. If you talk about any particular news venue, the press room at the state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, is decimated. You used to, every newspaper in every newspaper size in Illinois would have somebody there, right? It used to be in South Africa, in Johannesburg, that the Baltimore Sun had a person there, the Christian Science Monitor has it, the Times had 2 people, the numbers were extraordinary, and now this very small number. And so it's important for us to do that work. I think it's also, I guess, to take it forward on the legal side, there are a lot of newspapers and a lot of radio stations, a lot of TV stations in this country that can no longer stand up to the local bully. They cannot afford to do it. If they get a threat letter, they have to give in, because the cost of litigation is a lot.
Even with, don't most of them have libel insurance, or is it still prohibited?
People have libel insurance, but you're going to have a deductible, and if for a newspaper that's struggling, let's say that you've got a really expensive policy with a $50,000 deductible. How many times are you going to spend $50,000 as a reporter? Salary in many towns, right? If you're going to take on 3 libel suits, you just lost 3 of your employees. And so I think it's important for us to stand up and help make law that protects everybody, but also just sets an example that people should stand up. So yeah, all those things come into play.
Ron?
with increasing frequency, stories are Associated Press and elsewhere being prepared by artificial intelligence. Tell us about how that affects your job.
Yeah, we have not gone very deep into AI. Just so people understand, in many of the places you read where you'll see a story about the stock market is actually prepared by a machine. It's read the tables and it can tell you whether it went up and down, and we'll have that story be told that way, sports stories, those sorts of things. So artificial intelligence as a communicator has not had a great effect on us. We just don't do a lot of that kind of routine scorekeeping type story, whether it's sports or the market. However, we do obviously benefit from it in some other ways. Algorithms that help us predict where advertising should go, algorithms that we use in reporting, and those two things are the future of legal problems that aren't really sexy and aren't really hard, but it's the whole battle with Europe. Does your website know too much about you that's private? They need to know that to serve advertising. The Europeans have said, no, they don't. They don't need to know that about me, and I have a right to control my own data. So I think that's going to be one of those fights. It's really driven by artificial intelligence in the sense that an algorithm takes that data and makes advertising and advertisers smarter. It's also going to be a fight for journalists. Our journalists are doing these incredible stories that involved using a whole lot of data and understanding it, but it also involves going to websites and trying to understand what's going on there in ways that the websites don't want us to do.
Let me ask you a question about data, because we're trying to teach our students a lot to use data. We know that that's where the future is going to be. Does it ever make you nervous when a bunch of journalists are interpreting data? Have you ever had lawsuits based on, no, that's not what the data says?
We've never, I can't think of any lawsuit. We're still old-fashioned. It's still, that we accuse somebody of a crime. That is not data-driven. We haven't had it in that regard. But I do think that on the other side, not on the publication side, not on the interpretation side, but on how we get the data is going to be one of the great frontiers. Look, you can't really cover Facebook and know the level of Russian intrusion and what it looked like and where it went without doing things that violate the terms of service, right? You need to look at thousands and thousands and thousands of messages and pages, and unless you're going to live a really long time and not have a deadline for 15 years, you're not going to get that done. But machines can do that and see where they came from and where the messages came from, where they were sent. Just to use the example, which doesn't involve legality, we are trying to find out. Back up one step. Some of you probably know that when net neutrality was being revoked by the Trump administration, FCC had a notice and comment period. They asked Americans to say what they think about it. That whole process was infiltrated by Russians and others putting in fake comments, looking like motivated Americans weighing in on this issue, and it wasn't so. We are currently litigating in the Southern District of New York our right to get the IP addresses, because the only way we can really tell that story, the general outlines no, but the only way we can really tell that story is to find out how many different IP addresses those comments can come from. How big was that conspiracy to thwart the notice and comment period? And in many ways, that's just emblematic of how the kind of reporting that needs to go on about the platform. The platform, in my mind, the platforms are not unlike Standard Oil was at one time, or the railroads at one time. Big, powerful, influential power brokers in society, and journalists had to go after them then, and they need to go after them now.
Raphael, you had a question.
I'm Raphael Leonard. I'm the Associate Dean of the college. You said at the beginning that you were I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe hopelessly optimistic at one point, and that over the last 27 months, norms have been destroyed and institutions are not doing as well as we might have thought. What do you see 27 months from now, regardless of what happens in the next election? Where are we going, and are you still as optimistic?
It's all going to be okay. I think that we're going to, whatever happens in the election, whoever gets elected, I think that we are going to have politics where people are going to want to talk about fake news and use the press as a foil for their political ambitions because it worked. And politicians do things that work, and as long as it works, it can be done. I think that in terms of getting some of the toxicity out of the culture and getting back to where I think we need to be, where there are institutions that are respected, even if they're not liked, respected, even if we disagree with them, is going to depend very much on one group in society, and that is conservatives, who know better. I mean, there is a large group of conservatives who understand that what the president does is bad for America. Put aside, they may agree with him on immigration, and they may agree with him on taxes, and that's how it works, but they attack on the institutions. They just know that's bad for America. And are they going to stay silent? Are they just going to stand there and say, I'm not going to stand up for the idea of a free press. I'm not going to stand up for the idea of an independent court. I'm not going to stand up for the idea of elections that we will respect. As you can imagine, that most of the time when I'm out talking about the book, I'm talking to people who are like-minded. And that is, there are people who read the New York Times and probably thought that Hillary Clinton would have been a better president. Most by a long shot. But a really interesting thing happened to me a couple weeks ago, and that was I was back in my hometown in Illinois. Grew up in a very, very small town, and my friends put on a book event. And so we've got 75 people out on a Friday afternoon, and I would say 55 of them probably voted for Trump. And, I made the point there, which I hope comes across in the book when in parts that deal with this, which is that I did not learn to love the First Amendment, believe in free press, walking around the streets of Manhattan. I learned about the value of free press walking around the streets of Monticello, Illinois. Because my parents were both veterans. My mother was a World War II veteran. My father was a World War II veteran. We were patriotic. But I learned about the value of free press growing up in a farm town in Illinois, because the one thing I knew as a kid growing up about politics was this: the governor goes to jail. Otto Kerr went to jail. Dan Walker went to jail. The third guy got off. Tim of the Hats, the lawyers on that. When Paul Powell, the Secretary of State, died, they found shoeboxes full of money in his office, right? Conservatives knew government couldn't be trusted. That's why you needed a free press. And that hallmark of conservative thinking somehow got lost. And that to me is what's really pulled the plug on things.
Kathy? I'm Kathy Best. I'm the incoming director of the new Howard Center for Investigative Journalism here. Okay. And a former State House reporter in Springfield, Illinois for the Quad City Times. All right. And St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And grew up about 40 miles away from where you did. Anyway, the question is, the Trump administration and with the help of Congress has put a lot of new judges on the federal bench, some of whom are not qualified. Are you concerned about that? And are you concerned about what that means for First Amendment cases going forward?
Yeah, and you'll appreciate this after I did that spiel about the governor going to jail. Yeah. The first person in the front row goes, "Nothing's changed," which is true. No, I think the jury literally is still out on the new judges, and some of the other lawyers may have, and Lucy may have opinions on this, but that the conservatives on the Supreme Court have bought into a libertarian view of the First Amendment, which happens to be kind of where I am at the same time. And so I don't know if they're that kind of conservatives. And the other thing is, of course, a conservative hallmark used to be that one believed in the value of precedent and stare decisis, and that things are decided, we don't change our minds about this. So it is possible that the First Amendment is one of those issues where conservative lawyers now, who are now conservative judges, still will uphold the tradition of the past 60 years and be okay with it. I don't know that. I was just in my law school class, we were just talking about press conference cases. And of course, if you remember, Jim Acosta and CNN sue the president because he's had his press credentials taken away. And that judge was constantly described as a Trump appointee. And I'm sure in the White House, they were not really happy with his decision because, he said the White House isn't making sense about why the credential was pulled, and I'm going to reinstate it, and we'll go from there. So I think it's too soon to tell. We may end up with some of those conservatives may be real press haters, and some of them may be believers that the law is the law and should be upheld as the law.
We have time for one more question. Anybody? No? Yeah, everybody wants to go to the bar. Linda.
Well, since there is time, I'd like to have you go back to Marty's question about your role as a lawyer and not as a journalist. So I'm just trying to understand, do you see your role as primarily to help journalists skirt as close as they can to the edge but protecting the institution, or do you see your role as protecting the institution foremost, even if that means really narrowing the scope of a controversial story like sexual abuse or sexual harassment?
Let me answer that. Let me put one note on there at the front, because I always thought this was funny about the role of lawyers, is that Columbia Journalism, the Columbia Journalism Review about 10 years ago decided to do this series, How I Got the Story.
Right.
Okay? I was the first person they asked to write it. And I thought, this is really stupid. I've never gotten a story in my life. But they wanted me to talk about how I had helped David Barstow do a story about the Pentagon, for which he won the Pentagon Papers. And I said it was a little bit, asking me to write it was a little bit like asking Picasso's paint dealer, how did he do that? So the answer is in my particular case, our goal is to get it in the paper. And our goal is to do that even though there may be corporate risk. I personally believe that thanks to the good work of the lawyers who came before me, and Times versus Sullivan, the Pentagon Papers, and all the others, that the Supreme Court said, be courageous, and that lawyers who counsel people to be fearful have taken away what America has given them, what the Supreme Court has given them. So, and I'm fortunate, it's easy for me to be that brave because I work for a company that really believes in pushing the envelope, taking risks, and standing up for the journalism, and it's worked out. I don't think so much, you talked about getting close to the line and that sort of thing. I don't think of quite that way. I certainly believe that we have to take positions at times that go to where the law is unsettled, and I try to make my best possible judgment on that. If I come to the conclusion that the law doesn't protect us, I'll make that clear. But if it's ambiguous and unsettled, we're probably going to opt for publishing than not, rather than decide to back off because of the uncertainty.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.